The day the judge asked for one final document, my parents stopped looking at me and started looking at each other. That was the exact moment I realized the truth had been waiting years for someone brave enough to uncover it. My name is Ethan Walker, and if you had met my family before that morning, you would have believed we were the picture of the American dream. My father, Daniel Walker, owned a respected construction company outside Columbus, Ohio. My mother, Linda Walker, volunteered at church, organized charity events, and always smiled for every neighborhood photograph. My older brother, Ryan Walker, was the golden child everyone admired. I was simply the quiet son who never seemed to be enough. The courtroom was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers and the distant hum of the air conditioning. I could hear my own heartbeat as the judge adjusted his glasses and looked toward both legal teams. My attorney sat beside me without saying a word because we both knew the next few minutes could change everything. Across the aisle, my parents looked confident, almost relaxed, while Ryan leaned back in his chair wearing the same expression he had worn my entire life, one that said he expected the world to keep choosing him. Looking at him brought back memories I had spent years trying to bury. Growing up, Ryan was always first. If he won second place in a baseball tournament, my parents celebrated with a steak dinner downtown. When I earned perfect grades throughout high school, my report card was quietly placed on the kitchen counter before the conversation returned to Ryan's latest plans. Birthdays revolved around him. Family vacations revolved around him. Holidays revolved around him. Even relatives I barely knew would smile and ask about Ryan before remembering they had another nephew. At first I thought that was simply how older brothers were treated. As the years passed, I realized it had become something much deeper. Every sacrifice somehow belonged to me. Every opportunity somehow belonged to Ryan. When I received a scholarship offer from a respected university in Illinois, my parents convinced me to stay closer to home because Ryan needed financial help after changing majors for the third time. They called it doing the right thing for family. I believed them because I loved them. Instead of chasing the future I had imagined, I enrolled at a local college, worked evenings at a hardware store, and told myself everything would work out eventually. Ryan thanked me once, but only because my parents reminded him. A week later, everything returned to normal. He remained the center of every conversation while I quietly learned how to disappear inside my own home. Years later, I built a stable career in financial compliance. It was not glamorous, but I enjoyed solving complicated problems and paying attention to details other people overlooked. My apartment was modest. My pickup truck had more than 100,000 miles on it. I paid every bill on time and avoided unnecessary debt. My parents often compared my careful lifestyle to Ryan's exciting one. He drove luxury vehicles he could barely afford, posted vacation photos online, and talked about business ventures that seemed to change every season. Somehow they admired his confidence while describing my discipline as a lack of ambition. Family dinners became exhausting. My father would ask Ryan about investments, then turn to me only long enough to ask if I was still working at the same office. Before I could answer, someone would interrupt to compliment Ryan again. My mother always insisted they loved us equally, but love is difficult to measure when respect keeps flowing in only one direction. I learned to smile politely, finish my meal, and leave early. The fewer expectations I carried into those gatherings, the less disappointment I brought home afterward. Then my grandmother passed away peacefully at the age of 87. She had always been the one person who listened before judging, the one person who remembered every birthday without checking a calendar, the one person who told me that quiet people often noticed the truths everyone else missed. After the funeral, our family gathered inside her old house to discuss paperwork, memories, and the future of the property. My parents insisted everything had already been handled. Ryan nodded confidently beside them as though every decision had been made long before the rest of us arrived. Something about the conversation felt rehearsed. Questions were answered too quickly. Documents were folded away before anyone else could read them. Every instinct I had developed during years of reviewing financial records whispered that something wasn't right. I ignored that feeling for weeks because I wanted to believe my family would never hide something so important from me. But the doubt refused to disappear. Small inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. Dates didn't seem to match. Stories changed depending on who was speaking. One relative casually mentioned signing paperwork she barely remembered. Another assumed I had already received copies of documents I had never even seen. None of those details proved anything by themselves, yet together they formed a picture that refused to leave my mind. I told myself I wasn't searching for money. I wasn't searching for revenge. I was searching for the truth, because after spending my entire life being told I mattered less than my brother, I needed to know whether the story my parents had always repeated was actually real or simply another version of reality they expected everyone else to accept. That search eventually led me to the courtroom where I now sat waiting as the judge reached toward a sealed envelope neither side had mentioned before. My attorney slowly looked at me, and although neither of us spoke, I could see the same thought reflected in his eyes. Whatever was inside that envelope was about to answer questions that had haunted my family for years, and for the very first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what the truth might reveal. I was only afraid that it had taken so long for anyone to finally listen. For the next several weeks, I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but every time I replayed that afternoon in my grandmother's house, another detail refused to fit. My parents had always been organized, yet they suddenly became strangely protective of every document connected to her estate. Whenever I asked simple questions, my father answered with broad statements instead of specific facts. My mother smiled gently and reminded me that families should trust one another. Ryan acted as though everything had already been settled long before any official meeting took place. None of them became angry. They became careful, and after years of working in financial compliance, I had learned that careful behavior often deserved closer attention than emotional behavior. At work, I spent my days reviewing records, comparing dates, and identifying inconsistencies that most people overlooked. Numbers rarely lied, but people sometimes arranged them in ways that told incomplete stories. That habit of careful observation followed me home whether I wanted it to or not. One evening, I opened the notebook where I kept personal reminders and began writing down every conversation I could remember since my grandmother's funeral. At first, the list seemed harmless. My aunt believed the attorney had mailed everyone copies of the estate documents. My cousin remembered signing a visitor log at the attorney's office, but never seeing the final paperwork. My father insisted everything had been handled privately according to my grandmother's wishes. Ryan claimed he had barely been involved. None of those statements matched perfectly. They overlapped just enough to make me wonder what was missing. I still hoped there was an innocent explanation. I wanted one more than anyone else. The last thing I wanted was another reason to believe I had always been standing outside my own family looking in. During the following weekend, I drove nearly 90 miles back to my grandmother's neighborhood under the excuse of cleaning out a few remaining boxes in her garage. The familiar streets brought back memories of summer afternoons, homemade apple pie, and quiet conversations on her front porch. She had never treated Ryan and me differently. If she bought him a birthday gift, she bought one for me. If she praised one of us, she found something genuine to praise in the other. She believed fairness required effort, not convenience. Standing inside her empty house made the silence feel heavier than I expected. Most of the furniture had already been removed, but several shelves still held old family photo albums. I flipped through them slowly. There was Ryan holding a Little League trophy while I stood beside him smiling proudly. There was my high school graduation where my grandmother hugged me while my parents were talking with guests across the room. Another photograph showed all of us gathered around her dining table during Thanksgiving. Looking at those pictures reminded me that families rarely fall apart in a single dramatic moment. More often, they drift apart through thousands of tiny decisions that seem harmless until years have passed. Before leaving, I noticed an old file cabinet in the corner of a spare bedroom. It had already been emptied except for a few envelopes containing utility bills and greeting cards. Hidden beneath them was a small appointment card from a local law office dated less than 2 months before my grandmother passed away. The name of the attorney matched the firm my parents had mentioned, but the date surprised me. According to my father, every legal matter had been completed nearly a year earlier. I slipped the card into my notebook, not because it proved anything, but because it contradicted the story I had been told. On the drive home, I kept asking myself the same question. Why would anyone misremember something so simple if there was nothing to hide? A few days later, I called the law office. I introduced myself politely and explained that I was one of Margaret Walker's grandsons hoping to understand the estate process. The receptionist remained professional, but explained that she could not discuss confidential matters over the telephone. Before ending the call, however, She casually confirmed that the office had indeed met with my grandmother several times during her final months. That single sentence echoed in my mind long after I hung up. Several meetings. Not one. Not years earlier. Several meetings near the end of her life. My father's timeline no longer made sense. I decided not to confront my family immediately. Experience had taught me that accusations without evidence only allowed people to dismiss legitimate concerns. Instead, I quietly requested publicly available property records from the county office. Most were routine and revealed nothing unusual. Then one document caught my attention. A transfer related to one parcel of land had been recorded later than I expected, and one signature appeared to have been witnessed under circumstances that seemed inconsistent with the dates I already knew. I stared at the page for several minutes before setting it down. I still could not conclude that anything improper had happened, but the questions were multiplying faster than the answers. I reached out to my longtime friend Mark Ellis, an attorney I had known since college. We met at a quiet coffee shop on a rainy Thursday evening. I placed the appointment card, copies of the public records, and my handwritten timeline on the table. Mark listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he did not tell me that my family had done anything wrong. He simply pointed to the timeline and said, "Ethan, if these dates are accurate, someone owes you a complete explanation." That sentence stayed with me all night. I realized I had spent my entire life accepting incomplete explanations because challenging them felt like betraying my family. Maybe that was why I had ignored so many warning signs for so many years. Mark suggested gathering every available document before making any decisions. He reminded me that facts were stronger than assumptions and patience was stronger than anger. I agreed because I was no longer searching for confirmation that my parents had chosen Ryan over me. I had lived with that reality for decades. What I needed now was something far more important. I needed to discover whether the story my family had protected so carefully was built on truth, or whether the foundation had been quietly rewritten while everyone expected me to keep believing it without ever asking a single question. The deeper I looked, the more I understood why the truth had remained hidden for so many years. It was not because the evidence had disappeared. It was because everyone around me had accepted the same familiar story without ever asking whether it was accurate. My parents had spent decades presenting Ryan as the dependable son and me as the one who questioned everything. By the time I finally began asking important questions, most people had already decided which version of our family they believed. That realization hurt more than I expected because I understood that proving the facts would not automatically change the opinions people had carried for years. Mark and I met again the following Monday in his office overlooking downtown Columbus. Thick folders covered the conference table, filled with public records, timelines, and notes from every conversation I could remember. He reviewed each page slowly, occasionally circling dates with a yellow marker. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He told me that while nothing we had collected proved wrongdoing by itself, several documents deserved much closer examination. He explained that courts did not make decisions based on feelings or assumptions. They relied on facts that could be verified. That was exactly what we needed. Over the next several weeks, I requested every public document that could legally be obtained. Property records, tax filings, deed transfers, probate filings, and archive county documents gradually filled an expanding collection of folders inside my apartment. My evenings became a routine of reading, comparing signatures, highlighting dates, and building timelines. Some nights I worked until well after midnight with nothing but a desk lamp and a cup of black coffee beside me. The process was exhausting, but for the first time in my life, I felt that I was no longer waiting for someone else to decide whether my questions mattered. I was searching for answers on my own. Then something unexpected happened. While reviewing county records, I noticed that one filing referenced another document that was missing from the public file. Mark immediately requested a certified copy through the proper legal channels. Several days later it arrived. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute after reading it. The document itself did not prove that anyone had intentionally done anything improper, but it introduced a timeline that directly conflicted with statements my parents had repeated for months. According to the paperwork, important decisions regarding my grandmother's property had continued much later than my father had claimed. I remembered the confidence in his voice when he insisted everything had been completed long before my grandmother became seriously ill. The records suggested otherwise. I still refused to believe there had to be malicious intent. Perhaps someone had simply remembered events incorrectly. Perhaps an honest mistake had been repeated until everyone accepted it as fact. I wanted that explanation because it allowed me to believe my family had not deliberately kept me in the dark. But every new record made that possibility more difficult to accept. One Saturday afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. She asked if I would come over for dinner because everyone missed seeing me. Her voice sounded warm, almost unusually friendly. For a brief moment, I wondered if she somehow sensed the distance growing between us. I accepted the invitation, hoping that maybe we could finally have an honest conversation. When I arrived, the evening began pleasantly enough. My father grilled steaks in the backyard, while Ryan enthusiastically described another business opportunity he planned to pursue. As always, my parents listened with admiration. Eventually, my mother turned toward me and asked whether work was keeping me busy. I answered honestly that I had been spending a great deal of time reviewing family paperwork related to Grandma's estate. The entire atmosphere changed almost instantly. Ryan stopped speaking. My father slowly set down his fork. My mother forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. My father casually asked why I would spend time on something that had already been resolved. I calmly explained that several documents appeared inconsistent and that I simply wanted to understand the complete history. Before I finished the sentence, Ryan laughed quietly and said I had always enjoyed making simple situations unnecessarily complicated. My mother gently suggested that I was allowing work to make me overly suspicious. Then my father looked directly at me and said something I had heard in different forms my entire life. He said, "Sometimes you just need to trust your family." Normally I would have apologized and changed the subject, but something inside me had changed. I looked back at him and answered respectfully that trust became stronger when people were willing to answer honest questions. Silence settled over the table. No one argued. No one explained anything. My father simply stood up, carried his plate into the kitchen, and the conversation never returned to the subject. Driving home that evening, I realized that my family had once again chosen avoidance over clarity. If there had been simple explanations, dinner had provided the perfect opportunity to share them. Instead, every question had been treated as though asking it was the real problem. The following week, Mark called with additional news. He had located another witness connected to one of the documents we had been reviewing. The individual had retired several years earlier, but still remembered portions of the estate process. We arranged a meeting. The retired administrative assistant welcomed us into her modest home and carefully reviewed copies of the paperwork. She never accused anyone of wrongdoing, but she pointed to one page and quietly remarked that she remembered additional discussions taking place after that document had been prepared. Her memory aligned almost perfectly with the appointment card I had found in my grandmother's house. Suddenly, two completely independent sources supported the same timeline. As we walked back to the parking lot, Mark looked at me with a seriousness I had not seen before. He said we had reached the point where speculation needed to end and formal legal discovery needed to begin. If important information had been withheld during the estate process, only the court would have the authority to require every relevant record to be produced. I sat quietly inside my truck for several minutes after he left. Filing a legal action against my own parents was never part of the life I wanted. It felt heavy, painful, and deeply personal. Yet I also knew that doing nothing would mean accepting unanswered questions for the rest of my life. I started the engine, took one long breath, and made the most difficult decision I had ever faced. I would not go to court because I wanted to defeat my family. I would go because the truth deserved one final chance to be heard without interruption, without assumptions, and without anyone deciding in advance whose voice mattered more. The paperwork was officially filed 3 weeks later, and from that moment forward my life changed in ways I never expected. Until then, the investigation had been private. Only Mark and I knew how many evenings had been spent comparing records and rebuilding timelines. Once the legal process began, silence disappeared. Notices were delivered. Attorneys became involved. Family members who had not called me in years suddenly remembered my phone number. Some wanted to understand what was happening. Others had already decided that I was tearing the family apart. I listened politely without arguing because I had learned something important over the previous months. People who reached conclusions before hearing the facts rarely changed their minds during a single conversation. My responsibility was no longer convincing everyone that I was right. My responsibility was making sure the truth had an opportunity to stand on its own. The first procedural hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. It was nothing like the dramatic courtroom scenes people imagine from television. Lawyers discussed schedules, document requests, deadlines, and legal procedures. The judge remained calm and professional, reminding everyone that the purpose of discovery was to establish facts rather than assumptions. Even so, sitting only a few feet away from my parents felt heavier than any business meeting I had ever attended. My father refused to look in my direction. My mother appeared exhausted, as though weeks of worry had quietly replaced years of confidence. Ryan occasionally whispered to his attorney while wearing the same expression that had always suggested certainty. Looking across that courtroom, I realized that every one of us believed we understood our family history. The court's job would be determining which parts of that history could actually be supported by evidence. During discovery, both sides exchanged documents according to legal procedure. Boxes of records gradually arrived from different sources: bank statements, correspondence, probate filings, property records, appointment logs, archived emails, and administrative notes began forming a timeline far more detailed than anything I had imagined. Some documents answered questions immediately. Others created entirely new questions. Mark often reminded me that complicated cases rarely depended upon one dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, they resembled a puzzle where every small piece mattered because it either supported or contradicted the larger picture. We reviewed everything carefully without rushing to conclusions. One afternoon, Mark called me into his office after receiving another group of records from the opposing side. He placed several documents beside each other across the conference table and quietly asked me to read every date out loud. At first, I did not notice anything unusual. Then one timeline overlapped another in a way that should not have been possible according to my father's previous statements. Certain discussions had clearly continued during a period when he repeatedly insisted that every important decision had already been finalized. The inconsistency itself was significant, not because it automatically proved deception, but because it demonstrated that the explanation my family had repeated for months could no longer be accepted without further examination. Mark simply nodded and placed those pages into a separate folder marked for trial preparation. As more records appeared, another pattern slowly emerged. Several individuals involved in the estate process had documented conversations that differed from my parents' recollections. None of those witnesses accused anyone of misconduct. They merely described events as they remembered them. Surprisingly, their independent accounts aligned with one another far more closely than they aligned with the version my family had presented. I found that deeply unsettling because memories naturally fade over time, yet these unrelated people consistently described similar sequences of events. Meanwhile, life outside the courtroom continued. I still reported to work every morning, attended meetings, completed compliance reviews, and answered emails. My coworkers knew I was involved in a personal legal matter, but very few knew the details. I appreciated that distance because the office remained one place where I was evaluated by the quality of my work instead of my family history. More than once I found myself grateful for routine responsibilities. Reviewing financial reports during the day gave my mind a break from constantly thinking about legal documents every evening. Then came the depositions. Each person answered questions under oath, while attorneys carefully clarified timelines and factual details. I was nervous before giving my own testimony, but Mark encouraged me to answer only what I personally knew and never speculate beyond that. The process was surprisingly respectful. Every answer mattered because accuracy mattered. When my parents later gave their testimony, I was not present, but Mark reviewed the transcripts after receiving them. He never shared unnecessary opinions. Instead, he highlighted several statements that would need to be compared with documentary evidence presented later. Once again, the issue was not emotion. It was consistency. Weeks passed, and the scheduled trial date finally arrived. Walking into the courthouse that morning felt strangely peaceful compared to everything that had happened before. The months of uncertainty were over. Whatever happened next would be decided through evidence instead of family assumptions. Reporters were not waiting outside because this was not a famous case. There were no television cameras or dramatic crowds. Only attorneys, court staff, family members, and a few interested observers quietly entering the building. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained professional and measured. The judge greeted both legal teams before reviewing preliminary matters. My attorney organized neatly labeled binders across the table while the opposing attorneys prepared their own exhibits. I noticed my mother clasping her hands tightly together. My father stared straight ahead without expression. Ryan occasionally glanced toward me, perhaps expecting anger or satisfaction, but I felt neither. I felt tired. Years of unanswered questions had brought all of us into that room, and regardless of the outcome, none of us could return to the family we had once believed existed. Opening statements began with each attorney explaining what they believed the evidence would demonstrate. Mark spoke carefully, avoiding dramatic language. He explained that this case was about establishing an accurate timeline, examining documentary records, and allowing the court to determine whether the complete truth had been presented throughout the estate process. The opposing attorney argued that misunderstandings and imperfect memories should not be confused with intentional concealment. Both explanations sounded reasonable on the surface. That was exactly why documents would matter more than opinions. As the first witnesses prepared to testify, I quietly folded my hands beneath the table and reminded myself why I had come. I had not spent months gathering records because I wanted revenge. I had come because facts deserved daylight. And somewhere within the thousands of pages stacked around that courtroom was a story that no one would be able to rewrite once every piece had finally been placed together. The testimony unfolded much more slowly than I had imagined. There were no dramatic interruptions, no raised voices, and no surprising speeches. Instead, every witness added another small piece to a puzzle that had remained incomplete for years. County employees explained how records were processed. Administrative staff described appointment schedules and document handling procedures. Financial records were reviewed one page at a time. The courtroom remained quiet because everyone understood that accuracy carried far more weight than emotion. I sat beside Mark listening carefully as each new exhibit appeared on the courtroom monitors. Occasionally, he wrote a short note on a legal pad and slid it toward me. Most of the time, the note contained only a date or the number of an exhibit because he wanted me to follow the timeline rather than react emotionally. That advice became increasingly important as familiar family memories collided with documented facts. My father testified with the same calm confidence he had always shown throughout my childhood. He explained that every important decision concerning my grandmother's estate had been made according to her wishes and that nothing significant had occurred after a certain period during her final months. His answers sounded reasonable, and anyone hearing only his testimony would probably have accepted his explanation without hesitation. My mother supported his recollection, describing the process as straightforward and complete. Ryan also testified that he believed everything had already been settled long before the final meetings at the attorney's office. Listening to all three of them tell nearly identical versions of the story reminded me of countless family dinners where questioning the accepted narrative had been treated as disrespect instead of curiosity. Then Mark stood and requested permission to introduce another sequence of exhibits. The judge approved the request, and a series of appointment logs appeared on the large courtroom display. They showed multiple documented meetings between my grandmother and the law office during a period that directly contradicted the timeline described by my parents. The courtroom remained silent while each date was carefully read into the official record. My father's attorney suggested that appointment records alone did not establish the subject of those meetings. Mark agreed immediately. He explained that the records were not being offered to prove conclusions, but rather to establish an accurate sequence of events. That distinction mattered. Step by step, the timeline was becoming more precise. The next witness was the retired administrative assistant Mark, and I had interviewed months earlier. She answered every question carefully and never exaggerated her memories. She acknowledged that time naturally affected recollection, but she confidently identified office procedures and confirmed that additional discussions regarding my grandmother's legal matters had continued later than previously suggested. Her testimony remained measured, respectful, and consistent with the appointment logs already admitted into evidence. Once again, no single statement proved everything. Together, however, the documents and testimony continued pointing in the same direction. During a brief recess, I remained seated while most people stepped into the hallway. I looked across the courtroom and noticed my mother quietly staring at the floor. Ryan spoke with his attorney in low tones, while my father reviewed papers without looking toward me. For the first time since the case had begun, I wondered whether they realized the timeline they had repeated for so long was beginning to unravel under careful examination. When court resumed, Mark requested permission to present one final group of documentary exhibits before calling the next witness. Thick binders were distributed to the judge, opposing counsel, and the witness stand. Every page had already been exchanged during discovery, so there were no surprises regarding their existence. The significance came from seeing them arranged chronologically for the first time. Mark slowly walked through the sequence, comparing appointment records, correspondence, filing dates, and supporting administrative notes. With every page, the inconsistencies became more difficult to dismiss as simple misunderstandings. Then the moment that had lived in my memory since the opening day of the trial finally arrived. Mark asked the court clerk to retrieve a sealed envelope that had been identified earlier but intentionally reserved until the supporting foundation had been established. The clerk carried it carefully to the bench. The judge examined the identifying information, confirmed the exhibit number with both attorneys, and authorized it to be opened in open court. I immediately recognized the envelope. It matched the one I had seen resting on the evidence table during the first morning of trial, when the judge briefly mentioned an exhibit that would be addressed later. Inside was an original document obtained through the court's discovery process after extensive legal requests had been completed. The document itself was not dramatic in appearance. It was simply another official record printed on ordinary paper. Yet as the judge reviewed its contents before allowing copies to be distributed, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed completely. Mark remained silent, allowing the document to speak for itself. The judge instructed everyone to take several minutes to examine the record carefully before questioning continued. I watched as my father's confident expression slowly disappeared. My mother read the first page, then immediately looked toward the second as though searching for something she hoped would be different. Ryan leaned closer, his earlier certainty replaced by visible confusion. The document established beyond question that a key representation repeated throughout the proceedings did not match the official record created at the time the events actually occurred. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was not a difference in personal opinion. The dates, signatures, and supporting references aligned with multiple independent records already admitted into evidence. The timeline presented by my family could no longer exist alongside the documented facts. No one raised their voice. No one argued. The silence inside the courtroom became more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could have been. The judge carefully looked from one legal team to the other before asking whether either side wished to address the newly admitted exhibit. Even the opposing attorney requested a few additional moments to review the record before responding. Mark quietly folded his hands and waited. He had never built this case around accusations. He had built it around patience, documentation, and consistency. Now those months of careful preparation had brought everyone to the same unavoidable point. For years my family had expected me to accept a version of events because they insisted it was true. Sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by official records that had finally been assembled in their proper order, I realized something that changed me forever. The greatest strength of the truth was not that it spoke loudly. Its greatest strength was that once every piece had been placed together, it no longer needed anyone to defend it. When the court resumed after the short recess, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed completely. The conversations between attorneys became quieter, the spectators leaned forward with greater attention, and even the judge seemed to recognize that the newly admitted document had shifted the direction of the entire case. Mark remained calm beside me. He had prepared for this moment for months, yet there was no sign of celebration on his face. He simply opened his notebook and waited for the proceedings to continue. That quiet confidence reminded me why I had trusted him from the beginning. He had never promised that we would win. He had only promised that if we stayed patient and allowed verified facts to lead the way, the truth would eventually become impossible to ignore. The judge invited the opposing counsel to respond to the newly admitted exhibit. After several moments of reviewing the document, the attorney acknowledged that the official record established a sequence of events that differed from the timeline previously described during testimony. He carefully avoided drawing conclusions, but his measured response carried enough weight for everyone in the courtroom to understand what had just happened. For the first time since the trial began, the discussion was no longer centered on conflicting memories. It had shifted toward reconciling sworn testimony with official records created at the time the events actually occurred. Mark then stood and methodically walked through each supporting exhibit once again. He displayed appointment logs, correspondence, filing records, and administrative notes beside the newly admitted document. One by one, each record reinforced the same conclusion. Independently, they appeared ordinary. Together, they formed a consistent and verifiable timeline that could not reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. The judge asked several clarifying questions directed toward both legal teams, carefully ensuring that every factual point was supported by evidence already admitted into the record. I admired the discipline of the process. Nobody rushed toward conclusions. Every answer had to be connected to documentation rather than assumptions. That was exactly why I had come to court instead of continuing endless family arguments around a dinner table. Facts could be tested. Feelings alone could not. My father was recalled to the witness stand for additional questioning. His posture remained composed, but his confidence no longer appeared effortless. Mark respectfully asked him to review several documents side by side before answering simple questions regarding dates and meetings. My father paused much longer than he had earlier in the trial. He admitted that some of the official records refreshed his memory differently than he had previously remembered. He explained that the estate process had been stressful and that many conversations had blended together over time. His answers were polite and measured, yet each acknowledgement moved the testimony closer to the documentary timeline already established by the evidence. My mother also returned to the witness stand. Her voice sounded softer than before. She explained that she had relied heavily upon my father and Ryan when discussing legal matters because she believed they understood the paperwork better than she did. As she reviewed the exhibits, she quietly admitted that several dates were different from what she had honestly believed for years. Looking at her, I realized something painful. Whether those misunderstandings had begun intentionally or simply through repeated assumptions, they had eventually become accepted family history. Once a story is repeated often enough inside a family, people sometimes stop asking whether it is accurate. Ryan's testimony proved to be the most difficult to follow. Earlier, he had expressed certainty that every major decision had already been completed before the final series of meetings at the attorney's office. Faced with the official records, however, he acknowledged that he had relied almost entirely upon conversations with our parents rather than his own personal knowledge of every document. That admission surprised the courtroom because it demonstrated that even Ryan had not independently verified many of the facts he had confidently repeated. The issue was no longer about choosing between two brothers. It had become about distinguishing verified records from assumptions that had quietly evolved into accepted truth. Throughout the testimony, I barely spoke. I answered only the questions directed toward me, and I spent the rest of the time listening. Years earlier, I would have interrupted, argued, or tried to defend myself against every unfair statement. Now I understood that none of those reactions would strengthen the evidence. The documents were doing what emotions never could. They were telling a story without anger. Late that afternoon, the judge summarized several factual findings that had become undisputed during the proceedings. The official records demonstrated that significant estate activity had continued later than originally represented. Multiple independent sources supported the revised timeline. Certain statements made earlier in the process were therefore inconsistent with the documentary evidence presented before the court. Although the judge had not yet issued a final ruling, hearing those observations spoken aloud felt like a weight slowly lifting from my shoulders. For most of my life, I had questioned my own memory because everyone around me insisted that their version of events was the only correct one. Sitting in that courtroom, I finally understood that questioning inconsistencies had never made me disloyal. It had made me observant. As the day's proceedings came to an end, the judge announced that closing arguments and the final ruling would take place after one remaining procedural session. Court adjourned for the afternoon. People quietly gathered their files and prepared to leave. My parents remained seated for several moments without speaking. Ryan stood beside them with an expression I had never seen before. It was not confidence, frustration, or pride. It looked more like uncertainty, as though he too had begun realizing that the family story he had accepted for decades might never have been as complete as he believed. I slowly collected my own papers and followed Mark toward the courthouse exit. Just before we reached the hallway, he stopped beside one of the large windows overlooking downtown Columbus. Without raising his voice, he smiled gently and said, "Ethan, today was never about proving that you were better than your family. Today was about giving the facts the opportunity to be heard." I looked back once more toward the courtroom doors before stepping into the late afternoon sunlight. For the first time in many years, I did not feel like the forgotten son desperately searching for approval. I felt like someone who had finally allowed the truth to stand on its own, and I knew that whatever the final ruling would be, no one could ever erase what the evidence had already revealed. The final day of the proceedings arrived with an unexpected sense of calm. Months earlier, I had imagined that I would feel nervous, angry, or even relieved by the time everything reached its conclusion. Instead, I simply felt ready. The endless uncertainty that had followed me through countless family gatherings had finally been replaced by something much stronger than hope. It had been replaced by clarity. As I walked through the courthouse doors that morning, I noticed familiar faces from the previous hearings quietly greeting one another in the hallway. Court staff organized files with practiced efficiency, attorneys reviewed their notes one last time, and the spectators who had followed the case settled into their seats. Everything appeared ordinary, yet I knew the decisions made that day would reshape relationships that had defined my entire life. Mark arrived carrying the same worn leather briefcase he had used since our first meeting. He smiled politely and reminded me that whatever happened next, we had already accomplished the most important objective. Every relevant fact had been placed before the court. No hidden assumptions remained. No unanswered questions had been ignored. The truth no longer depended upon who spoke the loudest, because it now existed within official records that everyone had the opportunity to examine. His words helped me breathe a little easier as we entered the courtroom together. Closing arguments began shortly afterward. The opposing attorney emphasized that families sometimes remembered complicated events differently and argued that imperfect recollections should not automatically be interpreted as deliberate attempts to mislead anyone. He acknowledged that the documentary evidence had clarified several important details, but encouraged the court to view the inconsistencies within the broader context of an emotionally difficult period surrounding my grandmother's final months. His presentation remained respectful and professional, and I appreciated that he avoided personal attacks. Mark then rose to deliver our closing argument. He never questioned anyone's emotions or intentions. Instead, he carefully returned to the documents that had guided the entire case. One exhibit led naturally to the next. Appointment records supported correspondence. Correspondence aligned with administrative notes. Administrative notes matched official filings. Independent witnesses confirmed the same sequence of events. None of those pieces relied upon speculation. Together, they established a timeline that could be verified from multiple reliable sources. Mark concluded by saying that the purpose of the legal system was not to reward louder voices or longer family histories, but to examine evidence fairly and allow verified facts to guide the outcome. When both attorneys finished, the courtroom became remarkably quiet. The judge spent several minutes reviewing notes before beginning to speak. Every sentence was measured and deliberate. The judge summarized the evidence, explaining how the documentary record had consistently demonstrated that important aspects of the estate process continued well beyond the period originally represented during testimony. The court found that the official records were more reliable than incomplete recollections when determining the factual timeline. Several earlier representations regarding the sequence of events could not be reconciled with the documentary evidence presented throughout the proceedings. Although the legal language remained formal, the meaning was unmistakable. The facts supported the version of events that Mark and I had carefully reconstructed over many months. Listening to those findings, I experienced something I had not expected. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated in the dramatic way people often imagine after winning a difficult case. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For years, I had questioned whether I was somehow imagining the unfair treatment that had shaped my relationship with my family. Every time I noticed an inconsistency, I had been told that I worried too much or complicated simple matters. Sitting inside that courtroom, I finally understood that paying attention had never been my weakness. Ignoring obvious questions would have been. After the judge concluded the ruling, people slowly began gathering their belongings. There were no emotional outbursts. There was only quiet reflection. My parents remained seated for several moments before standing. My father walked toward me with slower steps than I had ever seen from him. He stopped only a few feet away and looked directly into my eyes. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he admitted that throughout the years he had spent so much energy protecting Ryan from disappointment that he had never realized how often I had carried disappointment alone. He said that every small decision had seemed reasonable at the time, but looking back after hearing all the evidence together, he could finally see a pattern he had refused to recognize before. My mother quietly nodded beside him. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted that she had trusted familiar assumptions instead of asking difficult questions for herself. She apologized not only for the legal dispute, but also for the countless ordinary moments when she had failed to notice that fairness had gradually disappeared from our family. Ryan approached more hesitantly. He looked exhausted, as though the trial had forced him to examine parts of his own life that he had never questioned before. He admitted that he had accepted special treatment for so many years that it eventually felt normal. He said he had never intentionally wanted me to receive less, but he also admitted that he had rarely asked whether the opportunities given to him had come at my expense. Hearing those words did not erase the past, yet they carried a sincerity I had not heard before. I listened carefully before answering. I told all three of them that the most painful part of my life had never been the property, the paperwork, or even the legal process. The deepest wound had been growing up believing that I always had to earn a place in my own family, while someone else received that place automatically. I explained that I had not gone to court hoping to embarrass anyone or to prove I was better than my brother. I had gone because every family deserves the chance to build its future on truth instead of convenient stories. My father quietly lowered his head. My mother reached for my hand. Ryan simply stood beside us without saying another word. As we walked out of the courthouse together into the bright Ohio afternoon, I realized that the court had resolved the legal questions, but rebuilding trust would require something far more difficult than paperwork. It would require honesty practiced every single day. For the first time in many years, however, that possibility no longer felt impossible because every one of us had finally seen what happens when the truth is given the chance to speak for itself. The months that followed the court's decision moved much more quietly than the months leading up to it, and I quickly discovered that healing rarely arrives with the same dramatic energy as conflict. It appears through ordinary moments that most people would never notice. A phone call returned without hesitation. A conversation where everyone actually listened before responding. A family dinner where nobody felt the need to compare one child with another. Those simple moments gradually became the foundation of something our family had not experienced in many years. Trust was not restored because of a judge's ruling. Trust slowly returned because each of us finally accepted that honesty required consistent action rather than emotional promises. I focused on rebuilding my own life instead of replaying old disappointments. At work, I accepted additional responsibilities that I had previously avoided because I had spent so much emotional energy carrying the weight of family conflict. My supervisors noticed the change almost immediately. Within 6 months, I was promoted into a senior compliance leadership role, overseeing larger financial reviews and mentoring younger analysts entering the profession. Ironically, the skills that had once caused my family to describe me as overly cautious became the very qualities my colleagues respected most. Attention to detail, patience, careful listening, and the willingness to ask difficult questions before making important decisions had become strengths instead of flaws. Every evening when I drove home through the familiar streets of Columbus, I realized how much lighter life felt without constantly wondering whether I needed someone else's approval before believing in my own judgment. My parents also began changing in ways that surprised me. My father retired from daily operations at his construction company and spent more time reflecting on the choices he had made throughout his life. One afternoon, he invited me to lunch at a small diner we had never visited together before. There were no attorneys, no documents, and no uncomfortable silence between us. He simply wanted to talk. Over coffee, he admitted that he had always believed protecting Ryan meant helping the entire family remain stable. Looking back, He finally understood that repeatedly rescuing one child often required quietly expecting another child to sacrifice without recognition. He told me that he had mistaken dependence for love and fairness for disloyalty. Hearing him describe those realizations did not erase my childhood, but it helped me understand how ordinary decisions repeated over many years can slowly create extraordinary consequences. My mother found her own way of rebuilding our relationship. Instead of offering broad apologies, she began asking genuine questions about my life. She wanted to know about my work, my hobbies, my friends, and the goals I had quietly pursued without ever expecting recognition. Sometimes she laughed after realizing how many important moments she had missed simply because she had been too focused on solving Ryan's latest crisis. Those conversations were occasionally painful, but they were honest, and honesty had become far more valuable to me than comfort. Ryan's journey took the longest. For weeks after the trial, he remained distant, almost embarrassed to face me. Eventually, he called and asked if I would meet him at a public park where we used to play baseball as children. We walked several laps without discussing the case. Finally, he admitted that growing up as the favorite child had not made him stronger. In many ways, it had made him dependent upon constant reassurance. Every time life became difficult, he expected someone else to smooth the path ahead, because that had always happened before. The trial forced him to recognize that genuine confidence comes from accepting responsibility rather than expecting protection. He thanked me for refusing to remain silent, because without the truth, he might have continued repeating the same mistakes for the rest of his life. That conversation became the beginning of a new relationship between us. We were no longer competing for our parents' attention because there was finally nothing left to compete over. Thanksgiving arrived nearly a year after the court proceedings ended. For the first time in decades, our family gathered around the dining table without invisible expectations shaping every conversation. My father asked both Ryan and me about our work with equal interest. My mother proudly displayed photographs from all of our recent accomplishments instead of highlighting only one person's successes. At one point, she accidentally began comparing Ryan and me before stopping herself, smiling, and saying that every person follows a different path, and that every honest path deserves respect. We all laughed because the correction sounded small, yet everyone understood how meaningful it really was. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the back porch where cold November air filled the quiet neighborhood. My father joined me carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee. We stood together watching the last leaves drift across the yard before he finally spoke. He said that if someone had asked him years earlier which son needed the most support, he would have immediately answered Ryan. Now he believed he had asked the wrong question for decades. The better question should have been which son had quietly been carrying the heavier burden. He looked at me and admitted that he had never truly seen that burden until the evidence forced him to slow down and pay attention. I smiled and told him that the greatest gift the court had given our family was not the legal outcome. It was the opportunity to replace assumptions with understanding. We remained outside for several more minutes without saying much else because no additional words were necessary. Driving home that night, I thought about my grandmother and the quiet wisdom she had shared with me so many years earlier. She used to say that truth does not become stronger because people believe it. Truth remains strong even when nobody is willing to see it. I finally understood exactly what she meant. The legal case had eventually ended, the documents had been filed away, and the arguments had faded into memory. What remained was something much more valuable. I no longer measured my worth by how often I was chosen, praised, or compared with someone else. I measured it by the person I had become while refusing to abandon integrity even when doing so would have been easier. That quiet confidence followed me home that evening, and for the first time since childhood, I truly felt that my future belonged to me instead of my family's expectations. Several years have passed since the courtroom doors closed behind us, yet I still think about that season of my life whenever someone tells me that family loyalty means remaining silent. I understand why people believe that. I believed it myself for most of my life. I thought being a good son meant accepting every unfair decision without asking questions. I thought keeping peace was more important than seeking clarity. I thought love required endless sacrifice from one person while everyone else simply accepted the benefits. Looking back now, I realize I had confused silence with respect, and those are not the same thing. Respect allows people to speak honestly because it values truth. Silence often protects problems that continue growing until they eventually affect everyone. Today, my life looks very different from the one I imagined when this journey began. My career has continued to grow beyond anything I expected. I now lead a team responsible for reviewing complex compliance matters across several regional offices. And every young analyst who joins our department hears the same advice during their first week. I tell them that details matter because small inconsistencies often reveal larger truths. I encourage them to ask thoughtful questions instead of pretending certainty. Many of them probably think I am talking only about financial records, but every time I say those words, I remember my own family and the lesson that changed my life forever. My relationship with my parents also continues to evolve. We are not perfect, and I no longer expect perfection from anyone. There are still uncomfortable moments when old habits briefly return. Occasionally, my father catches himself interrupting me before stopping and apologizing. My mother sometimes laughs about how quickly she once accepted assumptions without checking the facts herself. Those moments no longer create arguments because they have become reminders of how much we have all changed. Growth is rarely dramatic. More often it appears in small corrections repeated consistently over time. Ryan and I have built a relationship that never existed during our childhood. Instead of competing for attention, we encourage each other's successes. He eventually started his own small consulting business after deciding he wanted to earn opportunities through preparation rather than expectation. Watching him build something patiently from the ground up has been one of the greatest surprises of my adult life. We meet for lunch several times each month, and our conversations no longer revolve around comparing achievements. We talk about our families, our work, and the responsibilities that come with becoming better men than we were yesterday. Every now and then we remember our grandmother. We often smile while recalling the quiet way she listened before speaking and how she somehow managed to make every grandchild feel equally important. The older I become, the more I appreciate the example she quietly lived. She never needed to raise her voice to influence people. She simply remained consistent, fair, and honest regardless of who happened to be standing in front of her. I finally understand that she was preparing me for challenges she knew I might someday face, without ever telling me exactly what those challenges would be. Last autumn, my parents invited the entire family to celebrate their wedding anniversary. Relatives traveled from several states. Children played across the backyard, and conversations filled every corner of the house. At one point, my father stood to thank everyone for coming. Then he surprised the entire family by sharing something deeply personal. He admitted that for many years he believed treating one child as stronger meant that child needed less attention, less encouragement, and less protection. He said that assumption had become the greatest mistake of his life because fairness cannot exist when one person's sacrifices are always expected and another person's comfort is always protected. He did not mention the court case by name. He did not need to. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. When he finished speaking, he walked over and placed his hand on my shoulder before thanking me for having the courage to pursue the truth even when it made everyone uncomfortable. I looked around the yard and noticed something I had never seen during family gatherings before. Nobody appeared embarrassed. Nobody looked away. Instead, people nodded quietly because honesty had finally replaced the old stories we had repeated for so many years. Driving home that evening, I realized that the greatest victory had never been the legal decision or the official records. Those things mattered because they corrected the facts, but they were only the beginning. The real victory was ending a cycle that might otherwise have continued into another generation. Future children in our family would grow up watching adults admit mistakes instead of hiding them. They would see fairness practiced instead of merely discussed. They would learn that asking respectful questions strengthens healthy relationships rather than destroying them. If my grandmother had been there, I believe she would have smiled quietly from the corner of the room without asking for any recognition at all. Sometimes people ask whether everything was worth the emotional cost. My answer never changes. The process was difficult, exhausting, and often painful, but living the rest of my life doubting what I knew to be true would have cost far more. The truth did not divide my family. The truth revealed where we had already become divided, and only after seeing that reality could we begin repairing it together. That is the lesson I carry with me every single day. You cannot build lasting peace on convenient stories, but you can build an entirely new future on honesty, accountability, and grace. Whenever I remember that morning in the courtroom, I no longer think first about the documents, the testimony, or the final ruling. I think about the moment I finally stopped measuring my value by other people's approval and started trusting the quiet voice inside me that had been asking honest questions all along. That decision changed my career, my family, and my future, but more importantly, it changed the person I saw every morning in the mirror. For the first time in my life, I no longer needed anyone else to choose me because I had finally learned that living with integrity is the greatest validation a person can ever receive.